what Prime Minister Netanyahu is alluding to is the decapitation of the regime and also a coordinated, perhaps not a joint strike, but a coordinated strike on the senior command and control structure over there in Iran. The consequence of us not having the appropriate ordnance is that our soldiers lose their limbs and they lose their lives. And there is no question, it's not contested, that the Biden administration did withhold shipments of 2,000-pound bombs. I frankly don't think that Hamas has any intention of disarming. So I think ultimately what we're going to see is an insistence that the IDF maintains full freedom of operation, military operation, inside the Gaza Strip. We're seeing the completion of the forced buildup by the Americans in this region. It's generally assessed by the Israeli defense establishment that that forced buildup is not of sufficient scale for a full takeover or occupation of Iran by the US military, just to put it into context. The Iranians, seeing the arrival of the aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, for example, will have their full attention trained on this massive buildup of ordnance by the Americans, and rightly so. And they are making threats in order to prevent the Americans from launching any type of strike whatsoever. Just to give you some examples of that, Ali Shamkhani, who was the former Minister of Defense in Iran and it was responsible for overseeing the Iranian nuclear program, has put out a quote that says, and I'm quoting now, "Any notion of a limited strike against Iran by the Americans is completely nonsensical." He goes on to say, "No matter the source or the degree of any strike, it will be viewed as an act of war. The response will be immediate, offensive, and unprecedented, and aimed at the aggressor, America, and aimed to the heart of Tel Aviv and all who support her." Now, it's against the backdrop of comments like that that Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying that any attack on Israel will be met with an unprecedented retaliation. I think that the term unprecedented will actually be best summed up with a direct effort to decapitate the regime over there in Iran. We've seen Israel do this before. Israel took out the command and control structure and the leadership of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. Israel did the very same with Nasrallah inside Lebanon after October the 7th. And I think that Israel has shown that it is capable of getting to anyone and everyone as and when it pleases, including in Iran. So I think that what Prime Minister Netanyahu is alluding to is potentially the decapitation of the regime and also a coordinated, perhaps not a joint strike, but a coordinated strike on the senior command and control structure over there in Iran. I believe that we can do it, and I believe that Israel should be unafraid of the saber-rattling and the jingoism of the Iranians. We will stand fast if they do decide to strike us. We will defend ourselves. We're capable of defending ourselves, as we've already proven. And I think that the Iranians would do well to heed the lessons of the very, very recent past, which has shown them not to be without some degree of power and some degree of menace, but wholly unable, despite that, to fell, topple, or destroy the state of Israel, as they often allude to their ability to do so during their public statements. So I think that this is an ongoing situation, one to continue watching, and I believe that Israel will emerge from any conflagration absolutely successful. With regard to Prime Minister Netanyahu's claim during the press conference that a number of Israel's soldiers fell as a result of an embargo that was imposed by the Biden administration, I think that many people here in Israel found that extremely controversial and surprising. I actually watched the press conference in full, and it was something that the Prime Minister said toward the tail end of the press conference, unsolicited. He wasn't asked about it. He seemed to want to get to that point. Just so that everybody understands when the Israel Defense Forces operates in a built-up area such as Gaza in the context of a hot war, a kinetic war, in very broad strokes, the way that it works in terms of the ground forces is that we first move the civilians from the area. They are taken away from the kinetic action that's about to happen by way of warnings. Everybody's aware of those warnings by this stage. I don't think I need to repeat them here. And once the area is clear of those civilians, usually a number of the structures will be demolished from the air or using ordnance, and then and only then the ground forces will move forward. And that has the result of sparing the lives of civilians inside the battle zone, and also sparing the lives and securing the lives of the members of the Israel Defense Forces. When you lose the ordnance that is required for the demolition of those structures, what it renders you having to do is to send your soldiers, house to house, window to window, door to door. And I absolutely believe, and I've said it for a great many months, that the consequence of us not having the appropriate ordnance is that our soldiers lose their limbs and they lose their lives. And there is no question, it's not contested, that the Biden administration did withhold shipments of 2,000-pound bombs during the course of this war. And they did so essentially because they were coming up to an election season. There was a move to oppose votes for the Democratic Party coming from the Muslim American community over there in Michigan, which is a very strong constituency of the Muslim American community. And to placate that constituency, President Biden decided to really turn the screw on Israel, of course, foolishly so, because I would say such a community is beyond any placating. They're not there for the placating. So that's the first thing. The other thing, though, is that for many years I've been saying Israel needs to move itself away from the military aid that is presented to it or agreed to by the Americans. And there are various reasons for that. Number one, we are now at a time, in my estimation, where we are seeing both in President Biden and President Trump the last of a generation where Israel is what's called in Yiddish a kishka issue, where they hold favorability toward the state of Israel in their gut, naturally so. Now, it doesn't mean that President Biden or President Trump will therefore act in perfect adherence to the wildest dreams that Israel has for its safety, security, and alliance with the United States of America, and nor does it mean that President Biden or President Trump are the last of the friends of Israel to occupy the White House. I'm not suggesting that, but what I am saying is they're the last of the generation where it's safe to presume that a president, an incumbent president, will naturally have an affinity for Israel. We're seeing a rapid rise of antipathy towards Israel, and Israel has to see that on the near horizon and plan appropriately. I just want to give you some details about the level of aid and why I believe Israel will muddle through very, very happily without American military assistance. So just going from 2021 to 2025, in 2021, the total amount of military spending by Israel was 24.34 billion. 2022 was 23.41 billion. 2023 was 27.5 billion. 2024, 46.51 billion. I want to say that again. 2024, the middle of this war, $46.51 billion. And in 2025, $29 billion. Now, the American military aid package taps out roughly, there are additional points of assistance to it as well, but it basically taps out at 3.8 billion. So when you take that as a percentage, in 2025, that hovers right around the 10% mark. Israel is more than capable of making up for such a shortfall. But I also want to give you some other numbers very quickly so that you understand the politics of this arrangement. So the KC-46A aerial refueling aircraft, okay, that is supplied to Israel by the Boeing Corporation, costs $2.4 billion. The JP-8 aviation fuel, diesel fuel, and unleaded gasoline that Israel benefits from, $3 billion. 18 CH-53K heavy lift helicopters with support equipment that came to Israel in 2021, that is supplied by Lockheed Martin, $3.4 billion. So let me tell you, folks, having done a lot of work in congressional offices on Capitol Hill, you are hard pressed to walk into the office of any elected official up there on the Hill without coming into contact with a lobbyist, including lobbyists from the aforementioned corporations, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and so on. They will not want to see this military aid dissipate or fade away. They obviously want the profits that this helps them to turn. But the truth is, Israel is well beyond the stage where it requires this assistance. And I believe that it's high time that we move ourselves away from it. One final point on the politics. Prime Minister Netanyahu, very often during an election, runs not against his opposition here in Israel, but he actually pitches himself as the only responsible adult able to hold off an adversarial American president. So he did that very effectively when Barack Obama, for example, was in office from 2008 to 2016. He did it again with President Joe Biden. With President Donald Trump, he doesn't have an adversarial president in the White House. And so what he's pitching here, in my opinion, when he says that within a decade, he wants to see Israel remove itself from the American military aid, is that he is the only responsible administrator of that process, that he alone is the man who understands the US-Israel relationship, and he needs to be in situ in order to handle the weaning by Israel of itself off the American military aid. So in short, I think that there's an element of electioneering behind that statement as well. We are coming up to the election season in Israel. It could be called sooner, it could be called at its scheduled time, but it's very much in the air, and I think that underpins what Bibi had to say. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that there's not going to be any rebuilding of the Gaza Strip unless Hamas disarms, as is supposed to be the sequence of events. I cannot understand why anybody would expect that Hamas can launch a murderous attack, a massacre, the way that it did on October the 7th, steal our people, kill our innocents, decapitate our men, our women, so on and so forth, and everything else that went on that dreadful day. And the end result is that we go in there and fight, and all of the Gazans are then promptly presented with brand new apartments in high-rise buildings, funded by the Qataris and the Saudis and the Emiratis and everybody else, as seems to be the general flow of thought at this time. I completely oppose that idea. I think it's an absurd idea. And I think that the Prime Minister is absolutely right to insist that there will be absolutely no rebuilding until Gaza is demilitarized, and specifically until Hamas disarms. Now, there are a number of plans that have been put forward as to how that process might be hastened, but I frankly don't think that Hamas has any intention of disarming. I don't think that anybody should put any faith in the notion that Hamas will disarm. I don't believe that there is any police force that can be formed up to oversee that process in the face of a recalcitrant Hamas. And so I think ultimately what we're going to see is an insistence by not just Prime Minister Netanyahu, but indeed any Prime Minister in Israel, that the IDF, for as long as is required, maintains full freedom of operation, military operation, inside the Gaza Strip, as and when it is required to deploy that freedom, as we've seen, by the way, in Judea and Samaria, where I want you all to keep in mind, there is a Palestinian Authority police force. It's just that it's not particularly effective. The IDF has to, day and night, go in and launch and carry out counter-terror operations all throughout Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, because that work cannot be left to the Palestinian Authority. It's going to be the same inside the Gaza Strip. The difference is that you've got this complication by way of the Board of Peace and its various stratas, and the notion that Turkey is going to have a say in the administering of Gaza, and the Qataris will have a say in the administering of Gaza, and that the Egyptians, by the way, for very different reasons, will have a say in the administering of Gaza. This is all complete nonsense. This will not work, and therefore the Prime Minister really needs to put his foot down and say that such a term as the involvement of those aforementioned parties will not be accepted. What do I personally want to see? I personally want to see, as I've said for a very long time, although at this stage I think it's a deeply forlorn hope, I would like to see that there is the incentivized relocation of the Gazan people in their entirety from the Gaza Strip, because Hamas is replenishing its numbers from among the Gazan people, make no mistake about it. It's replenishing its military and terror capabilities. And as long as they are there, and as long as the people of Gaza are supportive of them, as they are in too many cases, Israel is not going to know quiet on the border. The body of Ran Gvili, thankfully, has been laid to rest after 843 long days of war and nights of war, after an enormous degree of sacrifice being paid by our soldiers and by our civilians here in Israel as a result of the October 7th massacre. The last hostage is now home, albeit deceased, albeit not possessed of the gift of life. A hero nonetheless. He received a hero's burial, and his family can begin the process of mourning. And it's worth pointing out that this is the first time since 2014 that there has not been a single Israeli hostage inside the Gaza Strip. You might recall that Oren Shaul and Lieutenant Hadar Goldin were both killed and their remains taken into the Gaza Strip in the events preceding Operation Protective Edge in 2014. Hadar Goldin only recently having been returned home to us, and the body of Oron Shaul some months prior to that. So this is the first time since 2014 that we haven't had a hostage inside the Gaza Strip. Now, this raises the question that we now have the time to ask as to what should our policy be with regard to future kidnappings of our people. And there have been prior commissions that have come forward with suggestions about ending, for example, the release of Palestinian prisoners and terrorists, including terrorists with blood on their hands, in order to bring our people home. Now, I have to be very candid about this, and I'm going to give one general example and one far more personal example to demonstrate my point. The notion of a policy that one adheres to in the face of an Israeli being kidnapped is very easy to speak to in theory when you are part or attached to somebody who's been abducted into Gaza or into Lebanon. You will not necessarily be interested in what the policy is. You will be very interested in what the government of the day is going to do to bring your loved ones home. And I can guarantee you that within the collective of the 252 families whose loved ones had been abducted into Gaza on October the 7th, there will have been a great many who, prior to facing that reality, will have had a very clear theory and a clear policy within themselves as to what Israel's view should be in the event that an Israeli is taken into captivity by way of an abduction. And that view will have come undone as soon as the issue was thrust into their reality as a result of the depravity of Hamas. So we saw this, for example, with Gilad Shalit. Gilad Shalit was kidnapped in 2006, just prior to the Second Lebanon War. And there were many people who said, well, we shouldn't be releasing prisoners and terrorists to get a soldier home. I understand that sentiment, but I ask all of you who are watching this, would that seem to be a reasonable policy for you were it your son or your daughter, your brother or your sister, your father or your mother? Would you insist exclusively in the government adhering to a set policy, or would you want that government to be prepared to walk away from such a policy if it meant bringing your loved ones home? It's not straightforward. It's not a simple situation. I can sit here and say we should never negotiate with terrorists under any circumstances. But I say that with the luxury of not having anybody, thank God, in my immediate family having been abducted. Were I to be in that case, God forbid, I don't think that I would be so certain of a policy. And we saw that range of thoughts among the hostage families here in Israel in the wake of October the 7th. The other thing that I want to say is there's a phrase in Judaism that says, Al tadin et chavercha ad shetagia limkomo. Do not judge your friend until you stand essentially in his shoes. Life throws difficult quandaries at us. on a very personal note, just to share one anecdote, I have an older brother named Jonathan. That older brother required 3 liver transplants in the space of a week in 1998. My father is a devoutly religious man and a man of great faith and great honor. And when Jonathan was first transplanted, the first liver that he received from a cadaver failed. The second liver that he received was transplanted into him as a holdover. In other words, the surgeons knew that it was going to fail, but it would keep him alive until they found a third liver, which hopefully would be a match. And so my father found himself praying in the corridors of the hospital for a third liver to present itself. And he confided in me sometime thereafter that he was very troubled by the fact that he was praying for such a thing, because in effect, not with any sinister intent or any malice whatsoever, but in effect, he was essentially praying for someone else's son to perhaps fall from their motorcycle, be pronounced dead at the site, be an organ donor so that his son could live. Okay? So that is an example of a deeply complex situation that life visits upon us. And it's just one example. The hostage situation, the dilemma of what to do in the face of kidnappings is another example. And I think to show the complexity, there's an aphorism that's attributed to a former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin that says that you should fight terrorism as though there are no negotiations, and you should negotiate as though there is no terrorism. In other words, the pursuit of a positive outcome and the deployment of tools that are less than positive, these all exist as part of the general calculus. Of course, what I would just say with regard to kidnappings is I truly believe that our enemies would do very well to have learned the lesson that stealing our people does not pay. And if they want any evidence of that, they should go and look at the ruins in the Gaza Strip, for which they are entirely responsible as a result of their abductions on October the 7th. Thank you so much for watching this episode of The Briefing. I very much appreciate your time. And I want to ask you, if you haven't already done so, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and to like the show, because by doing so, you will hear all of our latest commentary and you'll see all of our top tier footage. And remember, guys, I really do want to hear what's on your mind, and I want to hear your questions and your reflections. So please be sure to put those in the comments section, and I'll see you next time.